Next up is the Center Street Cemetery, and I understand that both Mr. Beaumont and Mr. Gross are going to talk to us about that.
Bob Gross, Long Hill Road. I'm a member of the cemetery board, and I'm here with Mr. Beaumont. We are asking for the same amount of money we've had over the last few years to operate the cemetery, the town of Wallingford.
I used to know how many burials you averaged. I think it was between 7 and 13 a year. Is that still true? And how many did you have last year?
Okay, last year, this is Bob Gross speaking. The cemetery had, I have it written down here on a piece of paper, I think it was 16 last year, and we're running ahead of pace right now this year, unfortunately.
I also know we used to charge a $500 maintenance fee per burial. Is that still the case?
It's not. It's a perpetual care, and that's a customary fee that any cemetery will charge, and that's to maintain the grounds of the cemetery. Correct.
Yeah, I wasn't judging.
No, I'm explaining what it is. Oh, no, I'm not taking offense to it. I'm explaining because you said a fee, so I'm trying to just explain. It's called perpetual care, and it's to maintain the cemetery. And pretty much all cemeteries have that fee. I'm involved with 2 cemeteries, well, more than that, really. And that perpetual care is pretty much a standard fee, and it's done at pretty much every cemetery that I know of.
Yeah, and I remember, I think I was on the board when we passed that, I want to say 6 years ago or 7 years ago. We didn't charge anything, I think, prior to that.
No, the cemetery did charge a fee. It was just a lower fee, and we got it more in line to what other cemeteries are charging.
Is there a budget? Did anyone, maybe I missed it. Did we get a budget? Barbara?
No, you did not. We don't have one at this time. We're running off of what we ran off the last few years. And we do not have a budget at this time. The executive board is still working on one. You
had 15 burials last year, and you're running. No,
16.
16. Okay, it's a horrible question. You're going to generate more revenue. I mean, it's a cemetery, so I don't know how to ask this question without sounding horrible. But you're going to generate more revenue, so that I would think then. We've had Councilor Tata asking everyone, can you cut 1%? I would think in your case, you absolutely could cut 1% because you're going to generate more revenue. Is that without being?
Well,
I'm not trying to be heartless, but
we do not know we're going to generate more revenue for the fact that yes, there's going to be more deaths this year, guaranteed. There are already in town, but there's no guarantee that those burials will happen at Center Street Cemetery. So we cannot forecast what the Center Street Cemetery will get in revenue for that. And that's to maintain the grounds of the cemeteries. It's to help maintain the stones. So as more stones go in, it becomes more work for the cemetery and more dollars for the cemetery to maintain it.
Okay, but I thought you said you were running ahead of schedule already.
Well, we have four so far this year. And last year there was 3 at this point, so we are ahead.
Bob Beaumont, on the cemetery board also. Councilor Churchill, one thing I might mention, the fourth one we just had was an indigent burial, and we don't charge as much for those.
Understood. Thank you for that. I'm just thought about what is the capacity of the cemetery? I know do we have a sense of? I mean, it's 400 years old. I don't remember. How much room do we have?
Don't know to the exact number, but it's going to outlive all of us and your children.
That's good to know. I think when you talked about the maintenance of the stones, that made sense to me. That fee obviously covers that. I thought though that the purchase of the backhoe several years back was actually designed to save money because you could do things with the backhoe to move stones that before the backhoe you'd have to pay someone to do. Is that true?
Yes.
But your budget hasn't really changed.
We are keeping the budget really tight, yet the cemetery's expenses go up every year as everybody else's cost of expenses go up every year.
Yeah. Understood. I also think that Mr. Devaney is underpaid too, so I hope he's getting.
We're not even saying that. We're just saying the costs of running the cemetery.
I think he's underpaid. but that's fine. What I was just getting at is, years ago, we didn't charge as much and we didn't have the backhoe. Now we charge more. We have the backhoe. It can defray some of those maintenance expenses.
No, the backhoe helps dig graves also. And that saves us from having to hire somebody to come in with a backhoe.
Right.
And as expense to the cemetery. It also does other work around the cemetery and helps us just straighten out stones that the cemetery couldn't do before, but now can handle because the machine can do it for the cemetery.
Yeah. Yep. I totally agree. And that's all saving money. So I guess that's my.
It was not the question of saving money. It also beautifies the cemetery because, as you said before about Mr. Devaney, yes, for the hours that he puts in there and the skill set that he has, you are woefully, the cemetery association, what the cemetery association pays him is woefully low for what he does. Yeah. Correct.
I agree.
But I was just wondering about if we could get a budget as soon as possible. There's $85,000 and I understand some of it is Mr. Devaney's salary. I'm assuming that's the biggest portion, but I really have no idea what these expenses are. So if we could get even just a simple, P&L balance sheet printout from QuickBooks or something similar to that, that would be extremely helpful. So is that something you think we can get before we have the vote on the budget?
I would have to talk to the board on that, and I could not give you an affirmative answer.
I think I've unmuted you, Mr. Chardulo.
My original question had to do with the budgets for these social organizations. Mr. Cervoni, I thought you told me that, well, I know you told me that we had hard copy budgets with the proposed budget and justification. We just heard from Mr. Gross that they haven't submitted that and that for some reason they can't produce really what probably amounts to about a 2-page budget. I don't understand that.
We did have budgets for most of the other lines. I missed the fact that there was not one for the cemetery.
Last year, we had the same issue. And one of the reasons I asked the question this year is another member of the public had raised the question of seeing the cemetery budget. And at that time, I think Mr. Gross said that he was new to the position and they didn't have one. I followed up with the mayor on that, and I asked him whether he was requiring that. And, he also said that because of the turmoil in top management, et cetera, he didn't require that. So here we are again a year later, and we still don't have one. I said last year, and I'll say it again, I think it's irresponsible, and I do not think you should provide any funds to any social organization unless they provide a proposed documentation with justifications for how they're going to use this money. That's just good governance. Would you agree with that?
Generally speaking, we've historically had budgets from the cemetery.
You don't have one now. Maybe this should go to yourself and the mayor. I genuinely don't understand, and I don't think it should be accepted. And as I say, I don't see why you would provide funds to an organization that is not giving you rationale for giving them the funds. It just defies logic. Why would you do that? How would you audit it? Doesn't make any sense.
We do have a request letter. We have a request letter from the Cemetery Association.
Well, I'm talking about a budget and a justification for providing funds. Why don't we do that? Isn't that a requirement? Isn't that a legal requirement?
I can't tell you what we don't have. I can tell you that historically in the past, we have had budgets from them.
Why would, I guess I'll direct this to the council generally, anybody on the council. Are you folks comfortable approving a budget where you have no documentation, no justification?
That is a question that will ultimately be determined before the end of the process.
Okay. I'd like to get a legal reading on that, if I may. Is there a legal representation here?
there's no legal requirement. We decide what funding will be accorded to various activities where service is being performed by the town. Certainly there is significant service being performed by the town pursuant to the contract with the Cemetery Association to take care of the cemetery and basically administer the cemetery on behalf of the town, given that it is owned by the town. As you know, there's a lot involved with every budget, and we deal with it in a fairly constrained time frame. We certainly can look to endeavor to have a budget another year, but there's been plenty for us to deal with every year with the budget. And this is not a huge part of the budget as far as the cemetery cost. I'm not aware of any complaints regarding services provided by the cemetery. So it doesn't reach the highest levels of concern from my perception, but certainly we can work to try to see we have more of a budget request from the association for another year.
Was that the mayor, or was that the attorney, town attorney?
That was the mayor.
I would make it, first of all, I want to say that I'm not here complaining about the services that the cemetery or any other social organization is providing. As I said at the top of the meeting, I'm more concerned about the process and whether we're following proper procedures in terms of using taxpayer money. And so, as I say, if you know, here we have an organization asking for a certain amount of money, and they're saying, well, we can't tell you what we're going to use the money for. So it defies logic as to why you would accept that. What if they were asking for, instead of 85, 185? So it's really a principle, a very strong principle. As I say, the town has a responsibility to ensure that as stewards of the taxpayer money, of which I'm a part, you have a responsibility to make sure that when you're giving that money away, that you understand what you're giving it away for. There's adequate justification for it. And beyond that, there should be some kind of an audit process, maybe once a year or whatever. But I don't find that to be a satisfactory answer. I'm not sure where we're going to go with this, but I just want to make sure that it's duly noted that this is the second year in a row. I have no idea, absolutely no idea, why the cemetery can't produce this budget. I don't know. It's something mysterious.
One reason we have not provided a budget is simply because of the fact that, on advice of counsel, we are still in the middle of a lawsuit with a UNFOI lawsuit. Based on advice of counsel, we've been told not to provide a budget.
So that lawsuit has been going on for what, 2 years?
And it's been going on for longer than that, sir.
I'm sorry?
That has been going on for longer than that, over 2 years.
So if I'm understanding you, there's some kind of a lawsuit pending. Well, this is getting interesting. The more we talk about it, the more interesting it gets. There's a lawsuit pending. Therefore, you are not required to submit a budget document, and yet the town is giving you funds without the benefit of that document or justification. That's what I'm hearing.
On advice of our attorney.
Your attorney, is that the town attorney? You have an attorney separate and apart from the town? Is that what I'm understanding?
That is correct.
Mr. Tardillo, we are not a town agency.
I understand.
So we have a private attorney.
Okay, that's fine. But I come back to Mr. Cervoni and the mayor. We need some legal advice here. I mean, I don't find it acceptable as a citizen of Wallingford to hear what I'm hearing. It suggests to me that we're just not doing our job. So I appeal to the council, members of the council, you've heard this conversation. You folks have to intervene somehow here. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Councilor Fishpine, and then after that, Mr. Comerford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to figure out, a representation was made to us that a budget was not done. And then another representation was made to us that upon advice of council, they were advised not to release the budget to us. I'd really like to know the truth, because those two statements are in contrast.
All right, I'll speak. This is Bob Gross. We do not have a budget. We asked for the same amount of money as the previous years, and we're not going to go into it, Fishpine, because you're the one suing us.
Well, no, I'm not the one suing you, but anyway.
But you represent the person who's suing us.
I represent a client, yes, and I'm
Correct.
just trying to figure out, I mean, I don't understand what the advice of counsel has to do with it. If the document doesn't exist.
Does not exist at this time.
Okay, well, I'm just, why would we be relying upon advice of counsel, but it doesn't, not the first time I've run into these things, so, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Mr. Comerford.
Yeah, Bill Comerford, 5 Broadview Drive. Mr. Gross, I'm assuming you're there, Mr. Gross?
Yes.
You stated that your request was the same as last year?
The amount we received is the same as last year. We asked for a small increase for the cost of doing business had gone up, and so we asked for a small increase. The mayor requested that we receive the same amount as the previous years, and that goes back multiple years, and we are.
Okay, but I believe if I heard correctly, through this whole conversation, you stated that you asked for no increase. Is that the case, yes or no?
I don't remember what I said, Bill, but we're
I know, I have a copy of the letter, because Mr. Cervoni was going to read it. Can you please read the letter, Mr. Cervoni, that you were reaching for the request dated February 25th, 2020, please?
No, I'm not going to read the letter. And please, when you guys are talking, take turns one at a time, because you're chopping up the record.
I believe that Mr. Gross, the president of the Cemetery Association, stated numerous times that there was no increase. There wasn't. They asked for the same amount. They stated the same thing last year, where they said that the mayor said that they did not have to produce a budget because there was no additional increase asked for. This year, there clearly was. It says, in part, this year's increase is primarily due to a general increase in the cost of doing business over those years, meaning the past 2 years. So that kind of contradicts what Mr. Gross had just stated, in my opinion. So going back to those prior years, we the taxpayers that fund virtually 90-some-odd% of their budget, has no idea where the money, small, large, whether it's $85,000 or $150,000, we have no idea. Past, there has been well-documented information where there was questions about walls and gates and websites and so forth that, in my opinion, were funded by the taxpayers, that they decided to choose no action to be taken because the statute of limitations ran out. Well, maybe, and it's only a suggestion, maybe if the taxpayer had that information, just like today, we could talk intelligently and ask the same questions so that doesn't take place, but we don't. Let me ask this. Mr. Gross, has Jason Zandri from the town council reached out to you at any time asking specifically for your budget, actual budgets for the past 3 years? Not just this year, because your attorney apparently told you not to release this year's, but the last 3 years.
I haven't spoken to Jason in a while, so I don't know when he would have asked me that.
I didn't say ask. What I'm saying is, did he reach out to you in any communication, email, snail mail, anything? You received nothing?
I'd have to look. I have a shared email. I'd have to take a look.
So you didn't receive anything through the regular mail?
The regular mail? No, sir. Not through, as far as I know, I've received nothing through regular mail.
Okay, because to my concern is that Mr. Zandri did. and he reached through emails as well as through snail mail, and I've been asking him for this copy for well over 2 months. And this is more elusive than the Loch Ness Monster, apparently. So let's get to some questions. Mr. Balstrom-Midas stated that the Town Department of Public Works always has been responsible for the maintenance of the gates that are part of the wall surrounding the cemetery. Is that the opinion of the Cemetery Association?
That has nothing to do with the budget, so I don't
have your budget, so I can't. I'm asking about the maintenance of it. I don't have a budget in front of me. So part of your budget over all these years that you've been in charge, as I stated, Mr. Balstrom-Midas questioned under Public Works budget. He says his department is wholly responsible for the maintenance of those gates. Is that the cemetery's position? So it would never show up in your budget.
If Balstrom-Midas is saying it is, I don't know. That was his interpretation. I don't know.
So it would never show up in your budget then. We don't have your budget. So it wouldn't show up in your budget because we don't have your budget.
We don't, Bill, as we stated a little while ago, we don't have a budget for this year.
Years past, any year, it wouldn't fall under this year or prior years then.
I don't know, Bill, if it appeared in the previous budget. I don't have one in front of me.
The cemetery in the past, at the erection of the new building on Prince Street would house all the assets owned by the cemetery, so that the use of the building would not be needed. Is that the case?
You can restate that question, Bill?
The cemetery has stated in the past that the erection of the new building on Prince Street would house all the assets owned by the cemetery, that the use of the old building would not be needed. Is that the case?
I would have to talk to the sexton about that.
So you don't know? And are there costs associated with the new budget, your proposed budget, that would include, I'm assuming, maintenance for 2 buildings?
We don't have a budget.
The new lease agreement states that the Department of Public Works is responsible for tree maintenance, removal, as well as leaves and road maintenance. How has this reduced your budget?
I couldn't tell you for the hours put in, how that's reduced our maintenance fees to our maintenance people. I could not tell you that.
Well, in the past budgets that were supplied to the town council, including letters that were submitted to the mayor, it said that a large part of their maintenance costs associated with was the maintenance of trees, the leaves, and so forth. And clearly, the town Department of Public Works has taken that burden. So clearly, that, as Mr. Shortell, I believe, would probably concur, that should also reduce your budget. But without seeing the budget, we have no idea.
Bill, just so you know, it's a cemetery. So as leaves come off the trees, the maintenance department of the cemetery removes those leaves and piles them up in an area of the cemetery. Then the town comes in and takes away the piles. We still have labor to remove those leaves because it's needed to be done to keep the cemetery in a very respectful manner for when there's funerals and when people come to see their loved ones in that setting, that it's clean at all times. So the Cemetery Association still moves all the leaves, picks up debris, picks up sticks, removes low-hanging branches, debris that comes down, garbage that's in the cemetery. Yes, Public Works comes in and they're piled in a nice area, and then they come in with a truck and they take it away for us. But we still have, there's 8 acres down there, Bill, with a lot of trees. That's a lot of time to keep the cemetery, and if you go down there now and look at it, you'll be very impressed on how nice that cemetery looks. And that's important to the town, and it's important to everybody.
Shifting gears to that topic, part of the brand new building that was erected, it stated that all debris, maintenance, and so forth, all that debris would be put behind the brand new building. So if I went down there today, what you're telling me is all the branches and everything else would be nicely contained behind the new building, like it was approved for?
They're put based on the size of them and the area they can put in. Some of them are very large. Some of them need chainsaws to be cut up with and put into piles. There's only limited space in that area, Bill, and you know that.
The Town Corporation Council, in a letter to the Cemetery Association, stated that the association be committing town funds to headstones that are not of historic significance. Is that the case?
Say that again, Bill?
The Town Corporation Council, in my opinion, in a letter of the Cemetery Association, stated that the Cemetery Association shouldn't be committing town funds to headstones that are not historic significance. Is that the case?
What does that, interpret what that means to me, Bill. Interpret what you read that to mean.
What that means is, in the past, that the Cemetery Association received funds, and they probably approached $500,000 over a course of a certain amount of time. And that money was used to, in quotes unquote, restore headstones.
Mhm.
So, in my opinion, based upon the letter that was sent from Janice Small to the Cemetery Association via John Letourneau, I believe that, in my opinion, it alluded to the fact that the Cemetery Association shouldn't be committing any type of funds to restore any headstones, because, in her opinion, and this is my opinion, that it's private property. So the point of the matter is that you are theoretically taking the taxpayers' money to restore headstones that really have no business being paid for by the taxpayers. That's like Mr. Beaumont. I think Mr. Beaumont was the president of the in memoriam at some one point in time. Maybe he still is. But that's the equivalent of, why are we giving Mr. Beaumont the same amount of money? Because it doesn't have any type of historic significance. Why aren't we giving all the cemeteries in the town? So my point is, are you still doing the same thing with your budget? In other words, you still restore headstones by your own budget, but why are we doing that when we're committing taxpayers' funds to do so?
If I may take that, Bob.
Yeah, and I'll be happy to answer after.
Okay. Many of the headstones that are being repaired, to begin with, prior to the last few years, we were going out, having a contractor do most of the headstone repairs. Over the course of the last probably 4 or 5 years, Mr. Devaney has gotten to be more than just very good at doing some, the necessary repairs on them. And the bulk of them that are being repaired, in fact, are historic in nature, at least in terms of age. The older ones are the ones that tend to get knocked over, tend to get broken. Mr. Devaney has actually saved the association, has saved a lot of money by doing the work himself rather than having to contract it out. So we are replacing, I say replacing, we are repairing any headstones that need to be done every single year.
So then the answer then, Mr. Beaumont, to the question is that the Cemetery Association, through their budget that we don't have, is expending no money to restore any of the headstones per se. Mr. Devaney is doing it all, other than supplies.
Bill, as far as I know, that is factual.
Well, that's great.
Let me give you an anecdotal story. One day, as I'm walking through the cemetery, I noticed a headstone on the ground, one of the old ones, early 1800s, and it was broken in 3 pieces. I was meeting Bob to go over the grounds at the cemetery, told Bob about it, brought out the equipment, picked it up, brought it in. Within 2-3 weeks, it was back on its, it was back in the ground, because it doesn't have those old stones don't have bases. It was back in the ground. The cost, whatever the epoxies and so forth were, that's what he does for the cemetery. And it was a historic stone that you would normally have sent out, that would have could cost us thousands of dollars to do, Bill, by the time it gets back.
What constitutes historic versus what Janice Small's opinion of historic was? Has that been defined? Because again, we're talking upwards of over $500,000.
So what time frame is that? And that has to go way back, as far as I haven't seen $500,000, and I am assuming that if there was $500,000 before the town council in the last few years, that it would have piqued somebody's interest, the $500,000.
Well, it's kind of hard to even question because we don't have budgets. I have no idea where money goes. And without these things, how can anybody even ask questions intelligently? Then yes, it's in your own minutes. It's in your own minutes. Yes.
So we got to remember, we're looking at $85,000 a year. 5 years doesn't even come up to $450,000, and that's for everything. So those numbers, that $500,000, don't know what you're talking about.
It's in your minutes. And again, I don't want to belabor, and I appreciate Mr. Savoni indulging me here. In the past, the cemetery reduced their budget by 50% during tough times. It was well documented. Jerry Farrell Jr. used to be the president of the association. I think it was in 2009. I could be off. And it said that the town gives a lot of money back to the association and so forth, and they appreciate it. And because of that, they would like to give back 50% of their budget, and they clearly can operate on it. Just based upon what Mr. Shortell said, the things that I brought up, in my opinion, you should easily be able to do that. Have you looked at that? But we can't even ask those questions or even entertain any reductions because we don't have the budget.
Bill, we don't. There's no way we can operate on $42,500 a year. We will have a tough time to operate on $85,000 for the year. What happened in 2009? You'd have to ask Attorney Farrell Jr. about that. I couldn't speak for that. That's 11 years ago, Bill. And it has nothing to do with this year's budget. I have no idea what it was.
But that budget isn't here, so it is a possibility.
No, I never said that. I just said that we will have trouble maintaining the cemetery with $85,000. You understand what goes into a cemetery. So you know what goes into it. You know the time that's committed to be there. You know that the maintenance that has to be done. You know the hours that are put in, repairs that are done on a cemetery that's historic in nature from the 1680s forward. There's always work to be done down there.
Mr. Gross, I asked, and I appreciate you guys coming up to the plate because we never have the opportunity, at least for me, to ask any type of questions, even though Mr. Gouveia, the former president, said anytime anybody has any questions, they'd be more than willing to come to the town, including audits, showing the budgets and everything else. Why this is happening in this way, including town audit beyond me. In your own minutes, it stated that while digging graves, that this is the Sexton report, and I brought this up at the town council meeting, and I asked the mayor on several occasions to bring this up. Mayor, correct me if I'm wrong, if you can hear me.
You're bringing up minutes to meetings. Question here. You're bringing up minutes to meetings from when, and how does that pertain to the budget for this year in 2020?
Well, let me get to it. If I can finish, if I may. So I asked the mayor to do a follow-up, and apparently he decided not to. But the point of the matter is your own minutes by the sexton said that while digging graves, that he's unearthed 44 unmarked burials. Where are those identified, and is anywhere in your budget any at all amount of money to put some type of markation so that we know whether I'm walking down there or anybody is walking down there, it says, okay, this is, you know, an unmarked grave, or how are those being identified today, and is that in your budget?
That's not a budget question, and I think it has a bunch to do with your pending claim. So, Mr. Gross, you don't have to answer that.
That's fine, but unmarked graves are unmarked graves. Every cemetery has unmarked graves.
I just want to make one final statement. Decades and decades and decades and decades ago, the former president of the cemetery, Center Street Cemetery, down at the town clerk's office.
What does that have to do with this year's budget?
Because it does. If I may please finish, Mr. Chairman Cervone, I'd appreciate it. It states that the cemetery is going to be full in several years. That was a long time ago. Clearly,
what does it have to do with this year's budget?
Because they don't need, they just shut the thing down because there's no more burials. Based upon the facts that are in the town clerk's office, that they shouldn't be burying, in my opinion, shouldn't be burying anybody. And that while they are doing burials, they're unearthing other people, number one. And number two, they wouldn't have to have any of these expenditures other than the fact that they cut the grass, which would clearly reduce their overhead. But the fact of the matter is, those are facts, Mr. Savoni, and I know you're all about the facts. Those are the facts. I'll submit them to the town council. Thank you.
Can I just say something? It's Bob Gross. I used to sit on a board in New Haven called the Jewish Federation, and we have a cemetery association for the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven. On that board, we maintain, or I was a former member of, I'm not anymore on their board, that they maintain, I think it's 13 or 14 cemeteries. As Mr. Comerford was alluding to, some of these cemeteries don't have burials anymore. You should see the budgets of those cemeteries. You still have to maintain them. You still have to protect it from vandalism. You still have the older cemeteries where stones get damaged. Did you just leave all the stones on the ground? They do fall after time. There is still a great expense, even if you didn't have, so I'm just, for Mr. Comerford's knowledge here, that even if you don't have a burial, which we have plenty of room, and we're an active cemetery, and we're a historic cemetery, those cemeteries, which are 150 to even less than that old, they still require budgets and maintenance and dollars to be spent on them every year, more than just cutting grass.
Thank you. Mr. Chardulo, you have a follow-up. I'm going to ask you to be very focused and brief, please.
Yes. First of all, I want to say that I'm not questioning any dollar amount that the cemetery is asking for or any services that are performed. The conversation that just took place, I have no knowledge of it, and that's not my concern. But I do go back to, I would be making this point if it were any one of these organizations. I think that the town has a responsibility to maintain and to require proper documentation before they give taxpayer money to anyone. And they should ensure that they follow up in some way through an auditing process to make sure that that money is spent in the manner it was intended. And so I would just leave the council with a recommendation, and that is that I would recommend to the council that you not approve any money to the cemetery, or if you do, approve it contingent on getting the required documentation. And if there's some legal issue involved, Mr. Beaumont alluded to some kind of a legal reason on their end, that we get some kind of a legal statement from the town, which provides some rationale for what's going on here, because I'm very confused. And I suspect many of you are as well. Thank you.
Councilor Fishbein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to just state, when I first got on the council, I had asked the mayor when we go into budget time for any entity that isn't directly related to the town, that we get their budget, their latest bank statement, a statement from them as to the utilization of the money and the impact upon the group if they don't get that money. And unfortunately, in the 10 years that I've been on the council, we do not get all of that information. And, I think that we should get that information. This doesn't just apply to the cemetery. It applies to any group that is not run by, not overseen by the management of the town. And, I continually raise that objection, but I still don't understand why it doesn't happen. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, it appears that we are done with the cemetery. Thank you, Mr. Gross. Thank you, Mr. Beaumont.